right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucy August Perna, and I'll be presenting on workforce development for energy efficiency careers in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I am honored this evening to present on behalf of my SUMA colleagues, and a special thank you to our advisor, Natalie Unwin-Kurineri. So today we'll review our project and client, our methodology, key inputs and outputs, and review of final deliverables, as well as next steps for our client. So energy efficiency, which is defined as using less energy to achieve the same task or result, is a key solution to the climate and energy crisis. By reducing our overall energy demand, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and therefore our reliance on fossil fuels. Doing so while improving air quality and driving local economies through job creation. More than 2 million Americans work in the energy efficiency industry, making it the largest and fastest growing energy sector with jobs in high demand. Yet the industry is struggling to fill these open roles. The energy efficiency industry requires skilled technicians who can install and repair HVAC systems and weatherize homes, and who are trained in such specialties as building science and materials. There are simply not enough workers with these skills to meet the demand of the industry. Additionally, the current workforce lacks diversity, with limited pipelines that could help expand and diversify the field in order to meet the industry's growing workforce needs. For example, the energy efficiency industry has 90% fewer women and 50% fewer Black and Hispanic workers compared to national workforce averages. Both of these issues have prevented the energy efficiency industry from achieving its full climate change mitigating potential. This challenge affects all of us and formed the foundation of our capstone project. Our client, the Energy Efficiency Alliance, operates as the umbrella organization of two trade associations, the Energy Efficiency Alliance of New Jersey and the Keystone Energy Efficiency Alliance of Pennsylvania. They work to deploy education, outreach, and policy innovation to expand the market for energy efficiency in the Mid-Atlantic region. Together with EEA, on behalf of their 75 member companies, which include manufacturers, installers, technicians, and more, we worked to map the needs and strategies to help EEA play a deeper role in ensuring an adequate workforce for a clean energy economy in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The purpose of each of our key deliverables for the project will be to help EEA hone in on the greatest areas of opportunity, formulate clear policies and areas of focus, and better position themselves to attract and streamline the much needed funding and policy support across the industry. During the midterm, you heard from my colleague, Zhang Yi, who discussed the extensive research we had undertaken to help familiarize ourselves and establish a firm grounding of the industry, its key players, and key issues. Since then, we've worked to synthesize this research and map the full energy efficiency ecosystem and its interdependencies, clarify outstanding questions through more interviews, and prioritize our recommendations to inform the basis of our final report to EEA. So given the importance of the interviews and case studies in our process, I'd like to highlight a few findings from each. We conducted 11 individual interviews with the organizations that you see listed on this slide, and one group Q&A session with EEA members. Interviewees represented diverse perspectives from across the energy efficiency ecosystem, including state and federal government agencies, energy efficiency training providers, employers, and workforce development think tanks and advocacy groups. Conversations with interviewees were candid and honest, some helping to validate and clarify our research, while others offered differing perspectives and sometimes even conflicted with what we'd heard from before. This demonstrated the complexity of the underlying issues and, to an extent, the subjective nature and nuance of the challenges and opportunities. But overall, we did hear some common themes. For example, we heard about the importance that employers rethink their relationship with employees and work to demonstrate a better value proposition. What can employers offer to recruit and retain workers through added benefits like career development potential and lifelong learning opportunities? Some interviews helped us challenge our assumptions. For example, we learned about the psychological barriers that make recruiting fossil fuel workers into energy efficiency jobs less straightforward than we would have thought, and the role of unions as important yet complicated in this space. The case studies were another key input that helped us to understand and assess what successful workforce development models already exist that could be applied to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The case studies were selected based on the basis that they provided replicable workforce development solutions across one or more impact metric categories, including funding, cost and service models, business networks, and more. For example, the District of Columbia's Sustainable Energy Utility Program has increased its pool of eligible workers, particularly from vulnerable communities, by eliminating out-of-pocket costs through a utility tax, as well as offering an extensive externship program. Like this example, the team was careful to select case studies that were within reach and that we believe are realistic for EEA to adopt. From our interviews, research, and case studies, we identified 5 major gaps. So first, funding gaps. Paying for certifications and trainings can be a key barrier to bringing new people into the workforce, particularly those from historically disadvantaged communities. Direct funding is needed to help subsidize training costs, but perhaps equally important, indirect funding for so-called wraparound services, which include things like childcare services and transportation costs to attend trainings. We also noted recruitment and perception gaps. So recruitment strategies, we believe, are outdated and haven't evolved to consider new ways of bringing people into the field. Energy efficiency jobs are often acquired by word of mouth and who you know. This not only prevents growth within the industry, but also has contributed to a fairly homogenized workforce. Further, the fragmented and confusing nature of the industry and various skills and certifications required has led to a perception gap. Many potential employees simply don't understand what an energy efficiency job is or what it entails. Training gaps. So training often comes at a cost and doesn't always guarantee a job. It's also inconsistent and doesn't always match the needs of the workforce. We heard employers express frustration that they had to spend precious resources and time to retrain employees because prior training was inadequate for the job. And lastly, retention. The inconsistency and seasonality of energy efficiency work and the lack of benefits and value propositions has negatively impacted retention, with some employees choosing to leave the industry and take jobs in other industries that have more consistent work. From these findings, we began crafting our recommendations for the client. As discussed, one of the main challenges in the energy efficiency industry is that it's complex and fragmented, with many different stakeholders operating in silos. This complexity impacts the ability to secure funding, standardize training, support job placement, and more. We organized and categorized the key players into these major stakeholder groups. And from there, we constructed an energy efficiency workforce ecosystem map, which illustrates the flow of both human and financial capital between stakeholders. As you can see, this is a highly complex ecosystem, and it took us weeks to arrive at this final product in partnership with the client. This is a snapshot of one of these maps and an example of a key deliverable we produced. EEA will be able to use this map to support discussions with policymakers and funders who are best suited to help bridge gaps and uncover ways to provide more effective and streamlined funding mechanisms. And lastly, we wanted to share with you a few of our recommendations that will be included in our final report to EEA. These are by no means exhaustive, simply meant to illustrate at a high level how we framed our recommendations and the important links between stakeholders where better collaboration could help streamline solutions. A few of these recommendations I'll highlight here. So employers and training centers should upskill HR departments and modernize their recruitment strategies to account for the evolving ways diverse groups of people source their information. They can do this through technology-based platforms like texting, and by partnering with local community organizations like faith-based organizations and community rec centers and more in order to meet people where they already are. Federal and state agencies should provide tax incentives and grants to help subsidize the cost of training as well as these wraparound services. Additionally, emphasizing climate change and energy efficiency concepts and career tracks early in the public school curriculum would help expose a new generation to these opportunities and develop interest in these career pathways early on. Throughout this process, we did uncover some challenges that we anticipate could prevent quick adoption of some of our recommendations. For example, many of the industry's employers are small and therefore may lack the resources to upskill HR teams or adopt technology-based recruitment strategies. Additionally, systemic issues such as the need for wraparound services is not an issue that's unique to the energy efficiency industry. Our capstone team will be presenting our final recommendations to our client tomorrow. And we look forward to seeing how our deliverables can help support and bring value to Energy Efficiency Alliance and their members moving forward. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions. Great.
Hi, awesome presentation. Curious to know a little more about, like you said, the conversion, like kind of the converting employees and like what those like drawbacks were, or like kind of the social aspect of that. You
Are you
mentioned.
talking about the fossil fuel workers?
Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
Yeah, this was a really interesting insight that came out of a couple of our interviews, although there was some conflicting sort of opinions, but we hear a lot sort of from advocacy groups about recruiting, former coal workers, for example, into these energy jobs. And what we heard from interviewees was that there are psychological barriers, among other things. So there's some straightforward barriers, like just the wages aren't the same. But then what we thought was particularly unique was some of the psychological barriers, just this transitioning from sort of this skill and this practice that you've had your whole life. And sort of the kind of the complexity around that, and then having to learn an entire new trade and skill, especially in, potentially at the age that they're in, and just different certifications that are required. So it's really kind of relearning a new trade. And I think there's sort of political issues surrounding kind of underlying some of that as well. So what we believe is that there needs to be more of a focus and acknowledgement of that sort of psychological transition, which I don't think there is. There's sort of this assumption that why wouldn't they do that? And so we think that between government and sort of workforce agencies, they can sort of put more value on that this transition is actually quite difficult, and just needs sort of more acknowledgement and potentially more intentional programs to help get over some of those humps. So yeah, that was a really interesting part of our research.
That was a beautifully delivered presentation. I just had a question about the federal and state grants. As part of the next steps, could you elaborate on like what kind of programs you've looked at? And are you saying like existing programs should be utilized or new ones should be proposed? And what kind of government agencies would be involved?
Yeah. Well, in sort of recent news, obviously, I think everyone's really thrilled about the Inflation Reduction Act, which will definitely sort of direct some funding into this industry. So there is some new federal funding that is expected to kind of make its way down. There's also this program called the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is another federal government funding mechanism. What we've found is that only it's because of sort of the complexity of the space, particularly for smaller training centers or smaller employers, they actually don't have sort of the resources to know how to track down those funding opportunities and then apply for them. So that was one of the things that we are recommending, is particularly for these smaller employers who really sort of need access to that funding to help subsidize training or help with wage subsidies for like apprenticeship programs. There needs to be dedicated programs for them to help those sort of employers understand how to access this type of funding. So that's sort of one piece. And then the state programs really vary. So out of the case studies, for example, the most successful state-based funding programs were ones that were built into, for example, so New York's Block Power is funded predominantly from the mayor's budget. So it's a consistent, I think, through 2025 budget. So they know that they're going to have consistent stream of funding for the next 3 to 4 years, whereas some of the other gaps were conditional. So there's a state-based program in Pennsylvania that gets reevaluated every 5 years, and the funding is only sort of re-upped if they can prove that there are cost savings as a result of the funding that was provided, which puts a lot of pressure on, again, smaller employers or nonprofits or sort of these groups that have to sort of prove that there was an ROI with the funding that they got. And so we found that that actually really sort of is sort of a big barrier for some of these groups. So I hope that answers your question. The point is it varies significantly per state and how some of these programs are funded. And there's a lot of work to kind of streamline and help not only provide funding, but also help people understand how to access that funding. Oh, yeah, whoever raised their hand can unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed it. I think one of y'all's main points was, kind of moving talent from the traditional energy sector into the renewable and sustainable energy sector. Have y'all, and knowing that this is, focusing on Pennsylvania and New Jersey, have y'all looked at all into kind of, seeing where, geographic movement of, employees from traditional energy sectors like Lower Appalachia or the Permian Basin to, the East Coast in general? Is that anything that came up in discussion?
The honest answer is we didn't dig too much into current movement from sort of these fossil fuel industries so it was mostly kind of alluding that there was this gap and some of the reasons why we found that there is a gap with some recommendations.
Oh, it was so nice to meet you. What's your email? Could I take it just in case? Thanks. Or yes, I can put it in my notes app where all of the emails have gone and I need to.
It's Central Mining at bu.edu.
Oh, cool. Amazing. Okay, awesome. Yeah,
I don't know if I can do it. All right, she's muted now.
I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.